Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about some different approaches to the law and specifically some theoretical perspectives when it comes to the law. So just as a quick reminder, these are the readings that are required for this section of lectures, and please just feel free to email me or let me know if anyone has any questions about these readings and where to find them. So as a review, there are two major theoretical perspectives in law and society when viewing law. Again, I want to stress that these are kind of ideal types of theoretical ideas, but basically every theory of law can be kind of couched within either a conflict theory or a consensus theory of law. Conflict theory suggests that law is a tool by which the ruling class exercises its control, and law both protects the powerful, the property of the powerful, and represses political threats. Basically, law becomes the institutionalized way that we have things in society, and the haves remain the haves and the have-nots remain the have-nots. It's trying to institutionalize any sort of discrimination or inequalities that are present in the system. Consensus is basically the opposite of that. Basic idea is that the interests in society often differ. The building of consensus is the most important to secure and maintain order, and the basic idea here in a consensus system is integrity, right? We have to mitigate potential conflicts and oil the machinery of social intercourse, right? It's a reflection of shared values. It's how society gets along. We may disagree on certain things, but how can we kind of come to a compromise within this consensus idea? As we look at each theoretical idea, it's important to see which area each of these things falls under. So the first theoretical idea we're going to talk about is functionalism. And functionalism is the single most significant body of theory in social sciences in the present century, and it's often thought to be a theory of order, stability, and how society is possible. And the basic concepts here are rooted in biological sciences, and says that each institution in society has a function that all contributes to the main whole of society. So, for example, we have our educational system, we have our medical system, our healthcare system, we have our legal system, and all of these things kind of work together to keep society moving forward. So, in much the same way we have a cardiovascular system, a respiratory system, and a digestive system, society has all of these different systems that function to help society. And one system can't really function on its own and be successful. If we have a legal system without education or healthcare, do laws really matter? If we have healthcare without education and law, does being healthy matter, right? And so it's through this integration of systems that make society function. All of these systems work together for good. When talking about functions, so it's important to note that there are two different types of functions too, right? There's intended and unintended functions in laws. Manifest functions are those functions that are built into a social system by design. We understand them very well, and it's the law's purpose in society. We all kind of get it. So, for example, minimum wage. Each person working gets paid a minimum amount for that work. We don't want people being exploited. We don't want slavery. And so we have functioned a minimum wage that is present in order to try and benefit everybody. We know how much to pay at a minimum. That minimum should give you the minimum you need to live. We all understand that, and we all conceptually understand that. That's the manifest function of minimum wage. Contrast that with a latent function. These are unintended, often unrecognized consequences of a system that have been set up to achieve other ends. These latent functions are not necessarily understood by the majority, and they're usually ignored by people or not realized until too late. So, for example, when minimum wage increases, unemployment typically also increases. Employers can't afford to pay as many people when minimum wage increases. And so, and one of the things, when we talk about minimum wage especially, and so before everyone gets excited in the comment section, right, Walmart, McDonald's, Starbucks, yes, they probably could afford to pay people more. Where minimum wage really actually hurts people is in small businesses. Small businesses really, really struggle with minimum wage because oftentimes the owners of the small business are working side by side with their employees. And if they had to suddenly, jump up $5 an hour for minimum wage, it then can kind of hurt small businesses. And so as a manifest function, minimum wage conceptually is a very good idea. We all understand that. We don't want people being subjected to slave labor or sweatshop-esque conditions. But as a latent function, there is some ideas that unemployment will go up, especially on small businesses and vulnerable businesses. So now that we kind of understand what functionalism is, what are some of the basic tenets of functionalism? Well, society should be analyzed as a system of interrelated parts, right? We've already kind of talked about this because of this, biological rooted system idea, right? We can't just talk about the law in and of itself. It is part of this larger system, and changes in one system affect changes in the other system. So, for example, if you have a stomach ache and your digestive system is off, doesn't that affect your respiration? You breathe a little heavier potentially if you're feeling nauseated. Does it affect your cognitive functioning? Of course it does, right? And so in the same way, right, if there's social strains in one system, it affects the whole of society. These systems, again, are in a state of dynamic equilibrium. This is where as one grows, the other one might, by necessity, have to shrink or vice versa. And we see this all the time, right? When Obamacare was passed, for example, that was a law that was passed that grew the healthcare industry, right? And so because the healthcare industry was growing, what did that affect and what did that push on? That pushed some on the legal industry or legal system. It pushed some on insurance. It pushed some on education. It pushed some on business and economics because now there was different requirements for benefits. And so you can see that an effect on one area doesn't just affect that area. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw our education system, because of stay-at-home orders, was very much strained in some capacity, in that people were either staying home or teachers were going house to house to educate people and stuff, and that put a tremendous strain on a bunch of other areas of people's lives. Perfect integration in functionalism is never attained between all of these social systems, as really there's no perfect system. And so if systems start to experience these strains or deviations, all the other systems are affected by it. And so as we try and correct one way, for example, when we tried to correct healthcare issues with Obamacare, that popped up other strains now in these other systems. And so in the functionalist approach, though, the basic argument is we're always trying to balance these strains and these deviations against other strains and deviations that are caused within the system. So in functionalism, change is fundamentally a slow and adaptive process. Change does not happen quickly, and there's never immediate reactions because it takes time for one system to deviate and change as a result of changes in the other. We did not, when Obamacare was passed, it's not like the very next day things were, going crazy in other systems, in our economic system or anything. It took a little while for people to start realizing, wow, these costs are more expensive than we anticipated, or we can't quite keep our doctors like we thought we could. So how do we address those changes? And that's why we've seen over time, as the years have progressed, iterations of Obamacare as it changes, because we have to give the system time to react to these changes that take place. Change is the consequence of adjustments of the changes outside the system, growth by differentiation, or internal innovations. And these are there's all sorts of different things that this could be. So for example, change as a consequence of the adjustment of changes outside the system could be things like environmental changes. This could be things like society changing the laws. It could be things like, for example, 9/11 or even COVID. COVID was not a change that we anticipated coming, but it rapidly changed virtually every system in our society as we know it. Then there's growth by differentiation. As our society grows, right, we start getting these specialized parts, right? So we need a more complex legal system or more complex mechanisms to handle things. So for example, we all carry cell phones in our pockets now. There is now a tremendous amount of law that dictates how cell phones are used. What is legal and illegal to do on cell phones? What can the police do with a cell phone during a search? 20 years ago, we didn't need that because we didn't have cell phones and they weren't that big of a deal. But because of this differentiation, we now have whole cybercrime areas and units just from the computer in general, from the advent of computers. We now have whole sections of federal law enforcement agencies dedicated just to cybercrimes. And there's also internal information. This is society growing and maturing, things like the Industrial Revolution, things like, as we continue to innovate and change, the system has it necessitates the system changing. So all these systems are integrated through shared values that are general, not specific shared values. So, for example, Republicans and Democrats might disagree on the mechanisms of helping the poor, but both sides want to help the poor in some capacity, right? And so these shared values are there generally in a functionalist approach. So Emil Durkheim, one of the largest sociologists to ever live, proposed that even deviance serves a social function in society. We need deviance to know where our boundaries are. It's kind of like, to use a sports analogy, right? If you're playing baseball, where the umpire's strike zone is affects how you play the game. If the umpire says, I have a large strike zone, that's because the umpire wants you to swing at everything. If the umpire says, no, I've got a very tight strike zone, I want pitchers to be very exact with where they're pitching the ball, that means probably don't swing it a whole lot and you'll get walked a decent amount. And so because of that, right, the umpire is setting the boundaries of what is and isn't acceptable. And that's basically what deviance does, is deviance sets the boundaries of you can go up to this line, but don't you dare cross it. And if you think about this in a very basic example like speeding, when we're all driving down the highway, probably most of us do not set our cruise at 70 miles an hour even, and just stay driving at 70. If you do, you're probably annoying everyone else on the highway, including me. We know that you could probably get away with going about up to 80 without getting a ticket. But we know that 85 and 90, if the police see you doing that, no good, and you're going to get pulled over. By having people that go 85 and 90 and seeing them pulled over on the side of the road, that reaffirms to us that's why I set my cruise at 75. Because I don't want to get a ticket, but I also want to get there as quick as possible. And so, certain institutions really cannot function without deviance. The existence of the sinner gives opportunity for believers to reaffirm their faith. We wouldn't need to have laws against robbery if nobody robbed. With marriage, why do we need to regulate marriage and institutionalize marriage in society? There is a natural kind of reaction to say, well, let's figure out boundaries to this. Even as a college professor, right? The first syllabi I ever wrote was like half a page, right? As a professor progresses, the syllabus becomes longer and longer and longer because there's more rules that have happened as a response to things that happen in the classroom. Things that you think, oh, this will never happen, I'll never have to worry about that, right up until it happens, and then you have a rule in the syllabus for it. So from a functionalist perspective, lawmaking is the restatement of some customs so that they can be reinforced by legal institutions, also known as a reinstitutionalized custom. And these are laws that represent the voice of the people because they're affirming these norms and values that we've already created and that most of society abides by. So, for example, right, in society today, more or less, the smoking of marijuana is viewed as not that big of a deal. And we're slowly, as time is going on, seeing states pass and legalize marijuana usage. In the 60s and 70s, that would have been more or less unheard of. But as society has started to progress, if you want to call it that, we're starting to see that people care a lot less about marijuana use, and therefore laws are being passed that reflect the will of the people. So in a consensus model, things like contractual relations, property laws, and marriage are all reflecting our belief about what's generally accepted in society. We more or less agree that in a marriage, in the event that marriage dissolves, property should be split, right? We more or less agree in contractual relationships. If you agree to do something, you got to do it now, right? Because we care about fairness in society, whatever that means, right? We care about this idea of people all being equal with each other. And so if I were to say to you, well, yeah, technically I signed a contract, but I decided not to abide by the terms of that contract, most people would want to know, one, why did I choose not to abide by the terms of the contract? If there was a justification for me not to abide by the terms of the contract, maybe they'd be okay with it. But second of all, they'd probably say, well, look, you signed a contract. I'm sorry, but it is what it is. You signed a contract. You got to live with the terms of that contract. And so we can see from this functionalist perspective where consensus matters. Of course, there are critiques of functionalism. Functionalism is oversimplified, as all the theories we're going to talk about are. There's also this question of functional for whom. the interests of different groups in society are often in conflict with each other. And we see this right now in big debates with Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, right? We're seeing these debates where it's like, well, what is functional? What does functional mean? People on the All Lives Matter argue, well, if Black lives really matter, then we need to be policing the inner cities, because if you're Black, you're most likely to be killed by another Black person. Which, by the way, much the same is true if you're white. You're much more likely to be killed by someone who is white. On the Black Lives Matter side of things, though, people say, well, no. We understand that Black people are the most likely to kill other Black people, but that's citizen killing citizen. When the police do it, it's the state killing citizen. And so why is it that in this group, there's much more likely to be, the state is much more likely to kill Black people? That's why we're suggesting Black Lives Matter, right? And so when we talk about functional for whom, that's kind of an example of one of these things where there's tension in the system of how do we want to handle this idea. Do we just say, well, any death is a bad death, and so before you start worrying about the state killing minorities, you need to worry about minority killing minority? Or do you say, no, minorities killing minorities are bad, but it's much worse when the state does it? There's also a bias toward conservatism. This is not political conservatism. This is more so slow to change type of conservatism. Functionalism doesn't really account for when change occurs quickly, right? The idea is, as the system deviates and changes, it's a slow, iterative process. When change happens very, very quickly, like, for example, gay marriage is something that really, in the grand scheme of society, there's a rapid change on. Barack Obama ran in 2008 on a platform of marriages between a man and a woman, and that's that. Before he left office, 8 years later, gay marriage was legalized in America. That's a rapid change. Functionalism can't really address that. It also attributes purposes to social institutions. Instead of talking about the people operating the social system, it talks about the system as a whole. But that's kind of silly, right? Because people are imperfect, people have biases, and it doesn't look at the influence of the individual. Our government is an institution, but is our government different when Barack Obama's president versus Donald Trump being president versus Joe Biden being president? Of course it is, right? And so is the White House, quote unquote, acting, or is it the people within the White House acting in certain areas? So that's the basic idea of functionalism. We're going to move on now to conflict and Marxist approaches. This is obviously within a conflict perspective, because the names are the same. And essentially, the basic idea here is that you have groups in society that clash with each other, and there's a struggle of scarce commodities, and conflict results from this struggle. And the law arises out of a conflict between groups. So this tension and conflict between groups is kind of focus of all conflict approaches. The source of these conflicts is typically economic determinism or the economy in general, right? Conflict and Marxist theorists argue that there are those people who have economic wealth and those that don't. And that the struggle is those that are wealthy try and maintain their wealth, those that are not try and become wealthy. The wealthy don't want more wealthy people, and so they try and oppress or suppress that lower class. So economic organization, especially the ownership of property, determines the organization of the rest of society. And so class structures, values, beliefs, they're all actually a reflection of the economic organization of society and much less on any sort of consensus. And so if you think about examples like being on time or dressing professionally, while we've been raised to think those are just general values for success, a conflict theorist would say, well, the reason people care about that is because people that have money are better able to do that than people that don't. So, for example, let's just take being on time. If you can afford a car, and especially historically, when you had to walk wherever you were going or ride a horse wherever you were going or something, right? If you could afford motorized transportation, you were almost guaranteed to be on time because you controlled your timeline of how you got to where you were going. If you rely on public transportation, or you had to walk, you're at the liberty of, or you are controlled by the whims of the public transportation system. If a bus is running early or running late, and you might miss it, that's just that, right? And so, or dressing professionally. You need to look the part, right? Dress for success. We hear this all the time. Dress for the job you want, not the job that you have. Well, that only worked if you can afford the clothes to dress for success. And so society is viewed as basically, from a content Marxist approach, like a table. The most important part of the table is obviously the top, right? The economic system is the top of the table. The supporting legs, each of the legs is analogous to a different system in society, our religious system, educational system, healthcare system, legal system. Without the legs, the economic system would obviously collapse. And so because of that, right, all of these systems are there to support, in American society at least, this capitalist venture, according to conflict and Marxist theorists. And Marx famously called the religious system the opiate of the masses because it keeps people satisfied with their lot in life. Be okay with where you are in life because that's where God wants you to be. So you just kind of accept it. Marx says, well, that's kind of silly. Why are there some people that have money and others that don't? So the law and the legal system are designed to regulate and preserve capitalist relations, according to Marx. And the law is a method of domination and social control by the ruling class. The law typically arises out of struggles between these two classes. And so the elite class has the power to keep the have-nots in their place. And so they pass laws, and the law becomes a weapon of that class, right? Marx is very focused on these power differentials. Haves are always the haves, and the have-nots are always the have-nots, and this power differential is there. Why? How is that the case? Why can't the have-nots move up or move down? Well, Marx says things like taxes, voting, and plea bargaining and Behl systems are all used by the haves to oppress the have-nots. So taxes, everyone has to pay taxes, right? And typically if you have more money, you pay more in taxes. However, there are things that you can do to reduce your tax burden. For example, a mortgage on your house, or donating to charity, or getting married and having children. All of these things reduce your tax burden. But all of these things require a decent amount of money to do. And so, yeah, everyone has to pay taxes, but some people proportionately pay less taxes because of all these other outlets that they've developed for themselves. And again, I'm framing all of these through the lens of a conflict or Marxist theorist. There's arguments to be made against all of these, of course, also. With voting, if there's only one voting location in your county, those people that can afford to take time off of work and can afford to get to the voting location are able to vote. If the voting locations are in the more affluent parts of town and it requires 3 bus stop changes to get to your voting location, you might be less incentivized to vote, which means the people in power that you voted in to quote-unquote represent you might be representing one particular class over another. Even plea bargaining and bail systems are problematic because, for example, plea bargaining. Let's say you're innocent. You get arrested for a crime, you're accused of a crime, but you know you're innocent. The state attorney comes to you and says, you can serve 3 months in jail if you plead guilty, or go ahead and plead not guilty, but your trial's not going to be for 1.5 years, and you're going to have to sit in jail this whole time because you can't afford bail to get out. Which one are you going to pick? 3 months in jail if you plead guilty, or 1.5 years in jail because you pled not guilty but you can't afford bail? I'd probably get out of jail in 3 months, right? And so those are kind of examples that Marx and conflict theorists use to say the law has become weaponized by a particular class. The state is an organized reflection of the interests of those ruling classes, too. Therefore, laws are passed to serve the interests of that class. The haves are individually enforcing and reinforcing their position, but they're also using the backing of the state to enforce that position, right? So let's pass laws to protect our capitalist interests. And we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. The only way to really remove this oppression, according to Marx, is to end the ruling class. Now, this is, of course, problematic as we've seen throughout history because the basic concept here is just let the people rule themselves and don't have a ruling class. America is about as close to representative government as we have in the world, right? The British Parliament is also similar to that. And it's pretty clear there's still a ruling class, right? And so even if we end the ruling class, practically it seems like all we're doing is replacing one ruling class with another. And that was very clear in communism throughout Eastern Europe after World War II as well. So we know the law results out of a clash between the classes. And so Marx argues that American criminal law specifically comes from English common law, but that murder, theft, trespassing, robbery, they were once solved in kinship groups. So there were tribes, and we talked about this earlier, right, in the semester, where there was these tribal conflicts, and they would be solved within the tribe. However, with increase in commerce and trade, a new business class emerged that was fairly wealthy. However, it became very, very cost prohibitive and very expensive for that business class to afford security for all of their business interests. So they said, now wait a minute, what if we decided to change the laws that instead of crimes against my business, they became crimes against the state? Or initially crimes against the crown that turned into crimes against the state. Then everyone is paying taxes to protect my business interests. So notions of crime have their origins less in the general ideas of right and wrong, but more in the perceived threats to groups with the power to protect their interests through the law. So, for example, why in the world do the police go to Target when someone is shoplifting from Target? Why isn't Target just taking care of this? Marx and conflict theorists would argue because Target has taken advantage of these laws by saying, hey, police, there's a theft happening here in Target. You need to come, you need to spend your money, and you need to come take care, investigate, and solve this crime so we can get our property back. Even though Target is a multi-billion-dollar corporation, the police are there at the service of Target. So, of course, like functionalism, there are critiques of conflict and Marxist theories as well. The theory is much too simplified, like all of them. It also hints at a monolithic ruling class. And we talked about this when we talked about, conflict and consensus paradigms early on in the semester. Group power changes over time quite a bit, right? From 2008 to 2016, Democrats controlled the White House. Then from 2016 to 2020, a Republican did. Then from 2020 and now up through the present, at least in 2021, Democrats control the White House again. Is the suggestion that all of these people are just in agreement with each other, or does this ruling class kind of change in power? It's also not sensitive to the complexities of real social interaction, right? Societal relationships change over time. It doesn't account for the conflict within these societal systems, right? So religious institutions give advice that go against our economic structure. Our economic structure gives advice that goes against our healthcare structure, right? Especially during COVID, we saw there's this real tension between healthcare and the economy, right? With one group saying we need to open up our businesses, we need to support our families, we need to pay our bills, and the other side saying, well, listen, you can do that, but y'all are going to die. We're trying to keep you guys from dying. Which one would you rather do? And so there's conflict even within the systems that conflict and Marxist approaches really don't do a great job of addressing. Now, in your readings for this section, you read The State by Lenin, where he basically makes the argument that power structures in society have stayed the same from slavery to feudalism to capitalism. And basically has suggested that really nothing has changed. And in fact, if you think about it, even in American society, when we freed the slaves, right? And I'm not advocating, slavery is horrific, so please don't misinterpret this. I'm just showing how Lenin would make this argument. Basically what happened was people were working for free, but they were given free food and free shelter. Not great food, not great shelter, but they were given the free necessities of life. On the flip side of that, we have people working in minimum wage jobs where they technically get paid for their labor, but they get paid just enough to afford crappy food and crappy shelter. Really, has anything changed? So what you're saying is, and in fact, right after the slaves were freed in the South, a lot of them stayed living on the plantations and stayed working on the plantations, stayed even living in some of the same accommodations on the plantations. They just got a wage for it that they turned around and gave right back to their employer in the form of rent and food costs. So has anything really changed? And again, please don't misinterpret that as me saying we should go back to slavery because nothing's changed. Of course, there are more rights. There are more, you can change jobs significantly easier today than you could when there was slavery in existence. But Lenin basically argued that nothing really changed throughout those processes. So from day clean to first dark, the argument is that modern day roles can be placed in this paradigm, kind of extending on the Lenin argument, right? We have masters, overseers, drivers, and slaves, and there are basically those same things present in society today. Let's take higher education, for example. The masters could be things like college presidents, and the overseers, upper-level administration. right? Overseers and masters are in a different class, in different buildings, behind different doors and with different privileges than the drivers and the slaves. Well, who are the drivers and the slaves? The slaves could be like the faculty members that are teaching, and then drivers could be things like department chairs or school deans. Slaves can become drivers, but that's as high as they're going to go. Overseers and masters don't really ever dip back down into the driver-slave area. So slaves, the most you could do is get promoted to be a driver, right? And there's advantages to being a driver. You're in charge of a bunch of the slaves. And from the powerful perspective, drivers, it's, hey, that's one of you telling you what to do. Hey, driver, I want them to go out and plow that back field. The driver comes out and says, hey, guys, here's the deal. We've got to go plow that back field. The slaves are grumbling, but they're grumbling to the driver. The driver makes a little bit more money, has slightly nicer accommodations, so they take the guff from the slaves. The slaves have something to look forward to. Look, there is upward progress. I could become a driver one day. But basically, once you hit driver status, you're really not going anywhere from a driver. You don't become an overseer and then a master from a driver. And so there's this kind of schism within our system where there's the masters and overseers that are completely separate and apart from the drivers and slaves, but there's the appearance, and there seems to be the at least presence of some system of upward mobility that motivates people to work. So does the law serve to maintain power structures or to break them down? Thornton and wife is a great example of this. We see that in this case, just from the very start, right? Mr. Thornton has to sue on behalf of his wife, who basically, for lack of better verbiage, needs a letter of recommendation to leave her job. Her job says, I don't want to give you a letter of recommendation because I want you to stay working for me. And she says, well, wait a minute, I want to leave and go work in this other factory because they pay more. Well, you can't get a job without a letter of recommendation. I'm not giving it to you. So even though you are a good worker, you don't have the power to really move around without this letter of recommendation from your boss. In the new free trade deal, we also see this with Nike, right? They're making shoes that they charge $100 for that cost 50 cents to make, and they're exploiting their workers in order to make those products. And so we see all the time that these power structures are very similar, where the worker who's actually making the product is paid a fraction of what the product sells for to enrich this other class. So, what perspective is most supported by these readings? It's clearly the conflict perspective is the most supported. And there's a compelling argument that's made that really power structures haven't changed throughout society. Again, there's oversimplifications of some of this, and there's much more nuance that could be involved. But the general idea of this conflict or Marxian explanation is just this, that power structures really haven't changed, and this is, societies are organized in a way to help the rich get richer and to keep the poor poor. So, as always, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or comment right here on the video, and I will talk to you guys soon.